Okay, welcome to part 10. Today we're talking about the importance of focal length, particularly in the context of portrait photography. And we'll also be looking at depth of field in more detail and the factors that impact on our depth of field and the blurring of our background. Okay, I just want to start by saying that depth of field is a fairly controversial subject that I've seen many lengthy arguments about on the internet. Somebody makes a statement about depth of field and then a bunch of keyboard warriors will jump on and say, well, actually that's completely incorrect because depth of field is a product of X times Y, and there's a lot of arguments around it. If you're one of those people who's a keyboard warrior, don't bother to put a comment below this video because it won't actually appear. I should be vetting the comments. This is a general, non-scientific, practical video about depth of field, which is designed to help beginners, to point them in the right direction. It's not a super scientific video, so for those of you who like to argue about these points, please move on. But first I want to talk about focal length in the context of portrait photography. Now, in that opening sequence you might have noticed that the initial shots at 200mm, which on my crop censored 80D equates to 320mm, that was a much more flattering angle on myself than the subsequent shot that was at 10mm on the 80D, which is equivalent of 16mm on a full frame. In those shots you'll have noticed that my nose looked huge, you couldn't really see my ears, I almost looked like a caricature of myself, and that was as a result of having the camera very close to my face rather than being a long way away from me and then zoomed in using a long telephoto lens. So you may also have noticed that with the shots taken with the telephoto lens that you could see my ears. My face looked more how you would expect to see it with the human eye, albeit not exactly as you would expect to see my face ordinarily. It's often said that our own eyes equate to a focal length of somewhere in the region of, some people say 35mm, some people say 50, but it's somewhere in that sort of range. So when we use very wide lenses and we get the camera very close to a person's face, that gives us a view of their face that we're not used to seeing and looks quite odd. And conversely, if we get too far away from our subject and zoom in too far, we can start to get a strange sort of almost widening of the face that again is not as we're used to seeing it. So we need to try and find a focal length that is flattering and doesn't look too unusual. Now, the focal length that we choose depends on what it is that we're trying to achieve with our shot. If I'm taking just a head and shoulders shot like this one, then I will tend to be shooting somewhere around the 150 to 200mm, which on a crop censored camera would be something more in the region of 100 to 125mm. And I tend to find that's quite a flattering focal length for headshots. Another focal length that is perfectly fine for portraits of individuals is 85mm. That's one that I often use. And again, if you're on a crop sensor, you're looking at roughly a 50mm, which is going to give you approximately the 85mm focal length of a full frame sensor. So focal length is important when we're taking photos of people, and as I say, if it's an individual person, then I'll tend to go somewhere in the 85mm to 200mm on a full frame camera. I think that's a nice range for individuals. Obviously, if you're shooting larger groups, then you're going to need a wider lens. 24mm would be good on a crop sensor, or 35mm, and those focal lengths are pretty good on a full frame as well, albeit they'll be quite a bit wider. But the thing that I've had the most questions about on my videos is depth of field, and although I've touched on this in several videos so far, obviously there's still things that I need to explain to make the whole depth of field thing a bit more clear to you. So I'm going to run through the factors that impact on the depth of field, and therefore how blurry our background is, and if there's anything in the foreground in front of our subject, how blurry that's going to be as well. And I'm going to start with an illustration of the most obvious thing that's going to impact on the depth of field and the background blur, which is the aperture setting on our camera. Okay, this is me at f1.4 on a crop censored 80D, and this is me at f22 on the 80D. Now, as you saw from that example, the lower we dial our f number down to, the blurrier our background is going to be. The second thing that impacts on the amount of background blur that we have, and this is one that I haven't properly covered, is the closer our subject is to the camera, the shallower our depth of field is going to be, and therefore the blurrier our background is going to be. Now, we can achieve a similar effect by zooming in on our subject if we have a zoom lens, and that will also blur the background more. So the way I think of it is, the more that my subject fills the frame, so the larger, let's say, the person is within the frame of the photo, the more we're going to blur our background. And I'm going to illustrate that. Okay, in this illustration I just want you to pay attention to the background and see what happens to the blurring of the background as I move closer and closer to the camera. Now, one thing that wouldn't be apparent from that example is that as I was walking towards the camera, not only was the background becoming more blurred, but the slice of the image that was in focus was actually getting thinner and thinner and thinner. So conversely, the further away our subject is from the camera, the deeper, the wider the section of our shot is going to be in focus. So this can be useful to know, because if you're shooting something that's a long way from your camera, if you dial your f number down to its minimum setting, you'll still find that the subject will be completely in focus. So just to take an extreme example, if you were taking a photo of a mountain range that's several miles away, even if your camera dials down as low as f1.4, you should be able to dial it down to f1.4 and still get the entire mountain range, from the mountains at the front to the mountains at the back. They should all be in focus because they're such a long way away from the camera. What you won't be able to do is get something that's close to the camera in focus at the same time as getting something that's a long distance away in focus at the same time. At the other end of the scale, if you're shooting macro photography, so let's say it's a shot of an insect which is only a few millimeters away from your lens, the depth of field can become so shallow that just the insect's head might be in focus, whereas its body and its legs can be out of focus. The third thing that impacts on the amount of background blur that we have is how far away is our background. Okay, in this example I'm standing about 3 feet away from the camera, but the background is fairly close to me, so pay attention to how much blur is in the background, and then we'll do a similar framing of myself but with the background further away. I'm now about the same distance from the camera, but because the background is further away, you should notice that it's a bit blurrier than in the previous shot. The final thing that is tied into camera to subject distance, and this is the controversial one, it's the size of the sensor. Now, before the keyboard warriors start, sensor size on its own doesn't impact on depth of field, but if we go to a larger sensor, because we're not getting that cropping in, we get a wider focal length. So to put it in layman's terms, when we're using a full frame sensor, our images are always wider. So in order to frame our shot properly, we have to get closer to our subject, and in getting closer to our subject, we are narrowing the depth of field and we're increasing our background blur. So if you think about using your cell phone or a point and shoot camera, you're going to struggle to get any background blur. Why? Well, it's a product of sensor size. Yes, you'll find that if you are shooting something very close to the camera's lens, then the background will blur, but day-to-day shooting, you're not going to see hardly any background blur. Conversely, a very large sensor, say a medium format sensor, which is even bigger than a full frame sensor, you're going to be seeing a lot more background blur because you're going to either be zooming in closer or you're going to be moving closer to your subject to compensate for the wider field of view that you'll end up getting when you use a larger sensor in your camera. And it's because of this that when you're buying lenses, I think everybody agrees that if you're buying a 24mm lens like I'm filming this with, and you're going to be mounting that onto a cropped sensor, and in the case of Canon cameras we have what's called a 1.6 crop factor. Most people agree that we take the 24mm, we multiply that by 1.6, which gives us about 38mm. So this 24mm lens on this camera is performing like a 38mm lens. What a lot of people disagree on, but you'll have to trust me, it's true. I also have to multiply the f1.4 that this lens can achieve at its widest by 1.6. So if I multiply 1.4 by 1.6, I get 2.25. So this lens, because of this whole distance from camera to subject thing, it ends up giving me the background blur equivalent to a f2.25 lens. So that's just a side note. When you're buying full frame lenses for crop sensor cameras, you need to do the multiplications just to work out how that lens is going to perform. Anyway, I want to keep this video to a reasonable length. As always, I hope there's something useful in there that's at the very least pointed you in the right direction, giving you something to think about. As always, thank you for watching. Please give this video a quick thumbs up. Feel free to comment, share, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and that'll encourage me to make more videos. Thank you for watching.